In many of our wildflower presentations, I have referred to the almost endless medicinal uses of wild plants down the long ages before the advent of modern medicine. So for our final outing, I thought I would take you here to the townland of Ballysheal, on the banks of the Brosna between Belmont and Ferban, not so much for what we can see on the ground today, but rather for the memories it holds. This is the site of the castle or tower house of the O'Shiel family. It was demolished in the last years of the 17th century or the early part of the 18th century in order to make room for the house that you see here today, itself now also in ruins, and which was probably built in large part from the stone of the old castle. The O'Shiels were the hereditary physicians of the McCaughlan chiefs of the barony of Garrycastle, from at least the 14th century down to the years 1654-58, when they were transplanted to the barony of Longford in County Galway. Now, in Gaelic society, the practice of medicine was hereditary in certain families, passed from one generation down to the next. And these doctors were educated in special medical schools, the most famous of which was at Athmacart in County Laois. And the position of the doctor in society was one of high status. It had considerable prestige. He was rewarded with land for his services to the chief and his family, and he also enjoyed a wide range of other privileges in society. Of the castle itself, very little survives, except for part of the bawn wall that enclosed it originally, and of course the stone reused in the building of Ballysheal House, which itself is of some architectural significance, a nice example of the classical symmetry and proportion that became characteristic of houses in the 18th century. The herb garden, which would have been here in the time of the O'Shiels, is long gone. But what has survived remarkably is one of the most important medicinal plants that would have grown in that garden. This is the old medieval Italian variety of parsley, which enjoyed a high medicinal reputation long before it found a valued place for itself in the kitchen sometime in the Middle Ages. And when it was used as a medicinal plant, it was the seeds and roots that were used, not the leaves, for a wide variety of complaints, particularly perhaps for ailments of the kidneys and bladder. The wonderful Hildegard of Bingen, among her many outstanding virtues, was a noted herbalist, and she prescribed parsley infused in wine for the circulation of the blood and for ailments of the heart. The classical name for parsley is Petroselinum, which in Greek means rock celery, which explains why it is so happy high up on the ruined walls of Ballysheal House. An impressive indicator of how long Ballysheal House has been in ruins is the ivy. You may remember that in a recent outing we admired arm-thick stems of ivy snaking up an ancient beech tree. But this stem is very much thicker than that. If I put this string around the stem and then measure it, you'll see that it's over 1 metre in circumference. And there's an equally impressive stem inside the house. This complex of ivy stems is well over 1 metre across, and you can see the way it's still tightly hugging the wall in spite of numerous attempts to remove it. Just outside the eastern wall of the bawn, over there where the silage bales are, there's a little hill which is known as Dispensary Hill. And this is where tradition claims that Dr. O'Shiel administered his prescriptions and gave his instructions. But something else rather wonderful has survived, preserved in the library of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin as the Book of the O'Shiels, which is a copy of their family manual of healing, transcribed in 1657 during the years of their transplantation, in which is preserved a list of the wild plants used in their prescriptions. Before the COVID restrictions, we had planned to take you to the Royal Irish Academy to turn the pages of the Book of the O'Shiels, but that's a privilege which will have to wait until next year. In the meantime, however, we can take a preliminary peep in advance of that post-COVID visit. The Book of the O'Shiels has 444 pages. The first part is taken up with extracts from some of the leading medical authorities of the age, and these were written originally in Latin and Greek, and are here translated into Irish. Now that gives us some indication of how familiar these medieval Irish physicians were with Latin and Greek, and also with the most recent developments in the medical universities of Europe, such as Montpellier and Salerno. But what is of most interest to us is the second half of the book, because this contains the herbal of the O'Shiel physicians, or at least the first part of it. But we know that the O'Shiel herbal was copied from a very important and much earlier text, the herbal of Taigo Queen, which was copied in 1415, the principal source for which was a manual known as the Circa Instans of Ioannis Platiarius, which was written in the second half of the 12th century. Now, among the many things of interest to us here is that here we have the Irish names for the plants used by the medieval herbal physicians and of how they were used. It is important to appreciate, although this is just about impossible for us now to understand, the complex philosophy on which the medical understanding of medicine in the Middle Ages was based. Suffice to say for now that the physician's assessment of a person's state of health was based on a sophisticated understanding of human well-being that was, if not quite fictitious, entirely metaphorical and unscientific. But it was filtered through the strainer of long experience. And it wasn't just a question of prescribing knotgrass if you are suffering from arthritis, for example. A particular diagnosis was made on the physician's assessment of a person's overall health and temperament, his or her personal history and lifestyle. A prescription was based not only on the basis of the particular ailment he or she presented with, and there were also astrological, astronomical, and environmental influences to consider as well. Although the Irish physicians drew on the same body of received wisdom as their European colleagues, they also needed to know to what extent centuries-long family tradition and local context supported the remedies recommended by the authorities. And one of the things that's particularly interesting about this is that although most of the text is copied from the Latin authorities of the time in Europe, for quite a considerable number, no Latin sources are known. This includes, in fact, several of the species that we met during the course of the year ourselves on our little expeditions. For example, yarrow, ahar talún, devil's bit scabious, castlebon beck, oxeye daisy, aspec bioin, knotgrass, glúnach beck, smooth sow thistle, serbon muck, valerian, sidwal, yellow flag, stolishdur, ground ivy, iron talún, along with all the ones we haven't had a chance to look at yet. And what's interesting about the recipes for these plants is that they're nearly always more elaborate than for other species in the herbals involving common, readily available plants. So it's thought that for these, the Irish physicians are drawing on a more purely Irish tradition. So armed with this introduction then, let's take a look at a few of these species. And as it happens, the very first chapter is wild arum or cuckoo pint, for which the Latin name is arum barba. It always begins by giving us the medieval Latin name. And this is the entry for cuckoo pint, for which the Irish is gyar. Gyar. The three names of the cuckoo pint. And it is clear, according to one noted authority, that the herb is hot and dry in the 3rd degree, and that it has a laxative, attenuating and dissolving virtues in its roots. If you mince this herb together with pig lard, it will dissolve, attenuate and ripen cold boils if a poultice of it is put on them. Again, if you mix equal quantities of cuckoo pint and mullein in a little bag of new linen, boil well in water and place hot on the anus, it will relieve the flux called hemorrhoids. And again, a fine powder of the roots can be put into sores in which there is protruding flesh. Or again, if you take the roots, dry them, make powder of them, mix them with rose water and put them on the face, it will take away its lumps and freckles and give it a bright, clear colour. Platyarius says that this herb has 4 virtues: the dissolving, the consuming, the laxative and the attenuating, and for that reason it is ordered in the case of abscesses of the ears to boil this herb in wine, oil and pig lard and put cumin powder in it, and to apply it as a poultice to the ears, and it will be helpful in diseases of the ears. It is appropriate to give this herb for the shortness of breath called asthma. If wild arum is pounded, then boiled in bear grease or in old lard of boar, strained and rubbed on the chest and the flanks, it will open up the breathing and soften up the chest. Again, if the juice of the herb is applied in the vagina as a pessary, it will provoke menstruation surely and gently, and if benedicta, which I think is Woodhaven's, is added to it, it will provoke menstruation all the more. Platyarius says that this herb has great effect in the winter and in the summer, and its effect is great in its foliage, and still more in its root, and more again than that in the tubers it has on it. If its roots are dried, it will have effect in all the things we have said for a year. So that's the entry for cuckoo pint. And more briefly, this is the entry for knotgrass, glúnach beck. Knotgrass is good in an ointment for those with violent pains. Take knotgrass, celandine, red rose, roots or foliage of fennel, clary, foliage of rue, burnet, saxifrage and chervil. Pound these herbs and make a water of them as with rose water, and it will clear the eye. Again, to make an ointment, proceed as follows. Take seeds of knotgrass, roots of horseradish, tops of watercress, autumn crocus, water crowfoot, seeds of nettle and roots of burnet. Pound these herbs, boil them in old pig lard, strain, put lard of hen and capon on it, and rub it on the feet in which there is gout and the swelling of edema, and it will help them. Also, if you take the foliage of valerian, knotgrass, lovage, mugwort and elder, boil them together in salt water and apply as a fomentation to the joints, it will help diseases of the joints. Next year, I hope you can join me on our postponed visit to the Royal Irish Academy, which houses the largest surviving collection of medieval and early Irish medical texts, and we can look at some of these rather terrifying remedies in the pages of the Irish herbals of bygone days, remembering that for everything you and I go to the pharmacy for, or consult our doctor for, they looked to the hedgerows in the fields and woods around them with similar certainty, confidence, or desperate hope.